Hi from Jerusalem. My name is Bernie Avishai, and I'm here to talk to you about Nemesis, um, Philip Roth's last novel. Um, this is Philip, um, actually a very dear friend, who died exactly 3 years ago this week. I wanted to give you a little bit of background on Philip, although some of you are probably aware of his name because of his notorious book, Portnoy's Complaint. But he actually wrote 30 books, won every possible award, National Book Award, the Booker Prize in England, the Pulitzer Prize, and so forth. He was famous for exploring the very thin line between autobiography and fiction, was famous for exploring sexuality in extraordinarily frank ways, which perhaps for us these days don't feel so frank. But in the 1950s and 60s, felt truly something of a breakthrough, particularly because he was so careful to wed sexuality to Freudian ideas about eros, and gave sexuality a tremendously thick and nuanced understanding as a driver, as a fuel for our lives, and was always so fascinated about how we could blow ourselves up in our own fuel. Um, Nemesis was his very last book. It was a kind of tribute to his childhood in Newark. Many of his books were. He was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1933, died at the age of 85. And many of his books were efforts to take you back into that childhood and understand the world from that frame of reference. And Nemesis is a particularly poignant piece of writing because it not only brings him back into his childhood experiences, which he renders in very loving and detailed ways, but it also raises the most fundamental questions that interested him not just throughout his life, but which, we struggle with all the time. So I won't say more about him right now. I will give you some sense of the book and the problems it raises, and then look forward to any questions you may have about him or about the book in a Q&A that Dan will set up later. So, Nemesis. What is the right thing to do? What is the good? And should doing it, if we can know it, bring happiness? These are not exactly new questions. They're also not exactly bad. There are ways in which you might say these questions are sophomoric. What is the good? Does doing the good bring happiness? If we can know it. The reason why we call them sophomoric is because sophomores raise terrific questions. I mean, it's the kind of thing you'll stay up in your dorm rooms at night pondering, along with, I suppose, free will and determinism. Also not exactly a bad question, which I promise you, I'm now in my 70s, so I promise you you'll spend your whole life struggling with these questions and you're not going to get a satisfactory answer. At least you won't get a definitive one, but they will bring you to a richer life. Nemesis raises these questions rather more starkly and elegantly than most other books that Philip Roth has written. But Nemesis also adds little twists that Aristotle, for example, never got to. So here is the scene. This is what the book is, as it were, about. It's 1944. It's Newark, and there's a polio epidemic. Bucky Cantor, 23 years old, 4F because of very bad eyesight. 4F means, of course, that he can't be drafted into the war, although most of his friends go off to war, is precocious, a mentor, and again, he sees his buddies going off to war, and he's trying to do justice to his young boys who he's mentoring. At first, he stays on the job, devoted, coaching his very active, febrile, vulnerable boys in the city. And this is sort of the greatest parallel to Camus, Albert Camus' The Plague, to which the book has often been compared, because Bucky, whom the narrator calls Mr. Cantor, by the way, that's important, that the narrator, we later find out, is one of his mentees. Bucky, Mr. Cantor, is sticking to his post, just like Dr. Rieux in The Plague. But also like Rieux, Bucky's wards start dying. Some of the kids he's taking care of start dying of the plague, of polio. His girlfriend, Marcia, who's off at a distant summer camp, urges him to join her at this summer camp, a prelude to engagement and the embrace of her loving family. Bucky was raised by his grandparents. He essentially was orphaned while he was very young. And he yearns for the kind of comfort that Marcia's invitation and her family's love would give him. He yearns for that. He didn't have parents, although his grandparents were very warm. But he refuses. He refuses to go. He sticks to his job. And then something happens. In what seems a spur-of-the-moment decision, an effort to be happy, you know, like Americans are supposed to be happy, a reluctant concession that all are victims of an epidemic no one controls or is responsible for. So why is he going to stick to his job when he can somehow avoid the plague, so he thinks, and be with his beloved? Bucky does join her. Dr. Rieux in The Plague says that we don't need to be heroes to fight the plague. All we need is common decency. And Bucky's disappointed boss, the fellow who's taking care of the park service and had employed him to mentor these kids, is sort of like Rieux and sort of feels the same way. Like if Bucky had this common decency, he would stick to his post. But the wrong thing in Rieux's case, actually and metaphorically, was pretty obvious. Fighting a plague meant fighting Nazi occupation. Here, it's not quite so clear what good Bucky is doing by staying in his post in Newark, other than to instruct his young boys. Indeed, Rieux's notion of common decency takes for granted uncommon valor, and it's not clear that this should be expected of Bucky, since his boys are dying anyway, and what can he do against the nemesis of the plague? polio. Anyway, Bucky and Marcia are reunited, and there's great tenderness to their lovemaking, which is another departure for Philip Roth, perhaps, to give that lovemaking the kind of tenderness, even one might say sentiment, that he would sometimes avoid, even scoff at in some of his other books. Yet Bucky, up in the summer camp, soon regrets his decision to come. It now seems to him, when he reflects on it, a sign of weakness, surrender, and he's racked with guilt for leaving his post. He determines he will return to mentor his boys, whatever the dangers, and he doesn't know yet that the job, in fact, had been terminated. Up in the summer camp, he didn't even realize that the job was no longer there. Nor can we know if this determination is not just a kind of arrogance. For Roth has given us a convincing sketch of Bucky's psyche by now, and the picture is mixed. The childhood unhappiness, his physical insecurities, he's small, he has very bad eyesight, his family's chaos, his impulse to overcompensate for being at home while his buddies were overseas, his comparative sexual squareness. Roth is implying that Bucky may actually have a kind of exaggerated sense of duty, that psychologically we're not exactly sure whether Bucky has his eye on the good he is supposed to do, or rather is psychologically predisposed to imagine himself a kind of messiah, to overinflate his role in the world, to overcompensate for his insecurities, which is not, Roth thinks, unusual in young people who are not parented very intensely and feel very lonely, and they can compensate for their insecurity by dreaming of exaggerated heroism and power. And now comes the big blow of fate, which is also a great irony. Tragically, Bucky discovers a few days later that he himself is the silent carrier infecting his Newark boys, that he would soon succumb himself to the disease. Ironically, in abandoning his job and fleeing Nemesis, he actually may have saved some boys, at least in Newark, though he wound up infecting various children at the camp. And now comes also the real moral problem of the book. Bucky recovers somewhat from polio, though his marvelous body is ravaged. He refuses even to see Marcia, holding fast to his seclusion. Finally, reluctantly, Bucky allows her to visit him. And she begs him to marry her as planned. What should he do? She loves him, no doubt, or at least the man he was. And now it is she, it seems, who is determined to do the good, to do the right thing, to take care of him, to cherish him, presumably enjoy his company, though we never get the idea Bucky was a spectacular conversationalist. Is Marcia, too, prone to an exaggerated sense of duty? Should Bucky marry her knowing he could never give her what he will get from her? And so this is what the book is really setting up. Two young people, each facing what seems like a great sense of duty, but also given psyches that we can't quite grasp, and we're never sure whether each of them in their own way had exaggerated their sense of duty or really they believed in this duty. And if they did believe in this duty, what is the source of the dignity they imagine which could allow them to do their duty in the face of such sacrifice? Roth has thus told us the story of a plague, of duty, but he's layered it with two Rothian features. First, what if we know that the man striving for the good has a peculiar psychological tic, which is strong, perhaps hubristic? Hubris, the desire to prove himself dutiful, morally better than average, or at least never disgraced by moral cowardice. In short, to be thought good. How, if at all, would such a propensity impinge on the worth of the moral decision? In other words, just because you know someone has a Messiah complex, does that mean that the value of what they do is diminished? Second, what if the man in question can be known only indirectly? And this is another Rothian feature. I said before, this is the kind of thing Aristotle didn't grapple with exactly. But what if we know this man only secondhand, since everything we learn about him is from a story told by a now skeptical former acolyte, a former mentee, a young boy who is telling the story about him in retrospect? And so we don't exactly know Bucky, but we know him through the screen of this narrator, who is an interested party for reasons I'll explain in a moment. How can we judge him if we can't judge the narrator of the facts? Or as Roth might have put it, the facts. Bucky chooses to break off the engagement. That's the climax of the book. Bucky chooses to break off the engagement. He concludes sadly that this is the right thing to do. And as I warned, Roth adds another ball to the juggling in his book. Because the narrator is this not disinterested young man, a young man who was once an admirer called Arnie, who, having recovered from polio himself, cannot really forgive Bucky for not getting on with his life as he, Arnie, had done. In spite of polio, Arnie had become a husband, a father, and, here's a nice touch, an architect making ramps for such invalids. He thinks Bucky was more or less nuts not to marry Marcia. Roth depicts most people around Bucky sharing this view. And so, is Arnie, our narrator, wrong? What, to ask the famous question of Immanuel Kant, if every crippled man married his fiancée? In other words, what if everybody did that? That's what Kant would say. To judge an act, you have to ask, what if everybody did that? Would that really be so bad? Many reviewers of the book struggled with this question. J.M. Coetzee, in a wonderful review in the New York Review, suggests that Bucky is not simply punishing himself for leaving his job, but aiming for a kind of tragic distinction that Arnie, and by implication, I suppose, ordinary Americans, you and me and so on, do not readily appreciate. Coetzee says, the good man, the Homeric hero, rejects the very concept of chance. In accepting the punishment of the Furies, Bucky determines to see life as meaningful, serious. Coetzee writes, this is what Coetzee writes now, what Arnie is unwilling to see, or at least unwilling to respect, is first the force of Bucky's why, and then the nature of Bucky's no, which, pig-headed, self-defeating, and absurd though it may be, nevertheless keeps an ideal of human dignity alive in the face of fate, Nemesis, the gods, God. And Coetzee is onto something. But Roth, I think, is implying, and if possible, an even more heroic conception of dignity in Nemesis than what Coetzee suggests here. Bucky is not rejecting being a victim of chance, in my view. Nor is he punishing himself in order to valorize, to endorse some mysterious design. He doesn't, it's not that Bucky imagines the gods in heaven, that his polio is a blow of fate, and he has to act out his role and become a sung hero like Odysseus. Rather, in my view, Bucky rejects living life as a victim in this radical sense. For this move, this way in which Bucky is dealing with the question of duty, of dignity, you can't simply acknowledge fate, Nemesis, the gods, all of which imply some kind of order behind events. I don't believe with Coetzee that Bucky, and certainly not Philip Roth, whom I knew well and knew his attitude towards this, he does not believe that reality is going to be ordered by some mysterious process. Bucky is indeed getting on with his life, but life to him means exercising his powers, or what's left of them, not surrendering to the gods, getting on with his life, or what's left of his powers, in the face of disorder, in the face of permanent and impossible disorder. Philip once had this wonderful line in another book of his, where he speaks about how we get things wrong and we get them wrong again. And then, after careful consideration, we get them wrong again. Bucky condemns himself for leaving his post, that's true, but that was in the past. Now he simply can't stand the thought of living his life as a burden on Marcia or anybody. His sense of dignity in the face of that disorder comes from some mysterious source. And I think that is truly a kind of Kantian idea. You know, Kant, in his wonderful short book called The Groundwork for Metaphysics of Morals, that I love in part because it's the only thing of Kant I could ever truly understand. He has this wonderful phrase that when things are a means to another end, then they have a price. But when something is an end in itself, it has a dignity. And the capacity to have dignity is mysterious. Kant thinks of it as of doing one's duty or pursuing the good asking whether you should do that which you imagine everybody else might do, or that no one else should not do. That very question has a mysterious source, a transcendental source. It's a kind of grace. It's a kind of mysterious grace. He called it categorical imperative, but in the end, we're really not able to understand this except through a kind of faith in the dignity of the other, in the capacity to treat another person as an end in yourself and not just as a means to my end. That you have a dignity and not just a price. The residual problem for Bucky is how to live his life with a kind of personal sovereignty that sees himself as dignified and attributes that dignity to everybody else, so that what he does is a kind of act of faith in the face of disorder, and not just, as Arnie would have him do, a pursuit of the ordinary pleasures of living. The residual problem for Bucky is whether it is right to live as a burden in what should be a partnership. Look, Bucky tells Arnie with a kind of magisterial poise. Look, he says, Marcia was a sweet, naive, well-brought-up girl with kindly, responsible parents who had taught her and her sisters to be polite and obliging. He's now looking back on this decision 20 years later, after Arnie had become, as I said before, this architect and had met Bucky later. She was this responsible girl, parents who had taught her and her sisters to be polite and obliging. He continues, she was a young, new first-grade teacher, wet behind the ears, a slip of a thing, inches shorter even than me. It didn't help her being more intelligent than me. She still didn't have any idea how to get out of, she didn't have any idea how to go about getting out of her mess. So I did it for her. I did what had to be done. Earlier, Bucky had told him, whatever was done was done. Whatever I did, I did. What I don't have, I live without. What I don't have, I live without. Nietzsche could not have said I more proudly or beautifully. We all go the way of Bucky, do we not? Contemplating the diminution of our powers, sickened by the prospect of becoming a burden, actually sickened by the prospect of no longer being ourselves. Roth has always spoken to that hyper-precious moment when the child has gone into eclipse and the adult pleasure of autonomy, bodies, risk, power, and its allies, surprising allies, bodies, risk, power, aggression, pitilessness, moral courage, present themselves. Pitilessness in some cases towards oneself. We may have nothing but working fictions about one another, as Arnie has of Bucky, Marcia of Bucky, Bucky of himself, and Roth of us. We have nothing but working fictions of ourselves, working fictions of one another, Arnie of Bucky, Marcia of Bucky, Bucky of himself, and Roth of us, you of me, you and Dan, Dan of you. Working fictions. But if happiness is possible, is it not in feeling the power of one's own judgment? Of acting in spite of serial misjudgments, getting things wrong, and after careful consideration, getting them wrong again. Happiness, at least according to Roth's mentoring, is not in accumulating means to future goods or becoming, as I said, a sung hero in the Greek sense. Not accumulating means to future apparent goods in the way Hobbes talks about, our bourgeois life, where we buy something and we acquire something and then we keep thinking about how that helps us get the next thing so that we can keep our survival going. No. Happiness is assuming the burdens of autonomy, doing what is right, not just what's understandable. And right means happiness. Doing the right thing gives us happiness because it means struggling to have a dignity and not just a price. Roth's last protagonist, this was his last book, is perhaps the capstone of a life's work that demonstrated to Americans how little a work our lives are fated to be.